3 a.m. The alarm clock's sharp beep echoed through the stillness of Emily's small bedroom. Its worn, mechanical sound had become her daily companion over the past few months, faithfully waking her up before the rest of the world even stirred. She had grown accustomed to it, although today felt different. A heaviness clung to the air. The faint ticking of the clock was her only company as she swung her legs over the side of the bed, her feet landing on the cold, creaky floorboards of the tiny house she and her children called home. Emily Thompson, 35 and weary from the life she had carved out of hardship, moved swiftly and silently. Her body, conditioned by countless early mornings and grueling walks, ached with the weight of another long day ahead. But she didn't complain. Complaining wasn't in her nature. There was no time for it, not when she had to walk 30 miles every day just to put food on the table for her two children. In the dim light of the small kitchen, she fixed herself a quick breakfast, a slice of dry toast and a cup of instant coffee, her meal as unadorned as her life. As the water boiled in the kettle, her eyes wandered to the window, where the world outside was still bathed in darkness. The cool morning air waited for her, and beyond it, the long road stretched out ahead, 30 miles there, 30 miles back. Emily let out a quiet sigh as she finished her toast. Her thoughts drifted to Jake and Sophie, her two reasons for every step she took. Jake was 12, a brilliant boy with a love for science that always made her smile. Sophie, her artistic little girl, was 8 and had a talent for drawing that far surpassed her years. They were her world, the reasons she fought so hard every single day. As the clock struck 3:30 a.m., Emily grabbed her worn-out sneakers, the soles patched with duct tape to keep them from falling apart. She laced them up, grimacing slightly as she stood, and felt the familiar ache in her feet. But she didn't let the pain slow her down. Her children needed her to be strong, and that's exactly what she would be. Emily glanced at the old family photo on the fridge as she walked out the door. It was from a happier time, back when her husband had still been around, before he left her to fend for herself and the kids. She hadn't heard from him in 3 years, not since the day he'd packed his bags and walked out without so much as a backward glance. He left them with nothing but debt and broken promises, but she refused to let that define her or her children's future. The cold morning air bit at her exposed skin as she stepped out onto the porch. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her body, but it did little to stave off the chill. The house was quiet behind her, her children still asleep, safe and warm in their beds. Emily inhaled deeply, steeling herself for the journey ahead. 30 miles was a long way, but she had done it before, and she would do it again. The town was still asleep as Emily set off down the road. The only sound was the rhythmic scuff of her sneakers against the pavement. She walked past empty streets, her path illuminated by the occasional street lamp. The world felt deserted at this hour, and in some ways Emily liked it that way. It gave her time to think, to reflect on the things that really mattered. Her thoughts wandered as she passed through familiar landmarks, old houses, small businesses, the gas station where she sometimes stopped to rest when her legs couldn't carry her any farther. Memories of better days flashed through her mind, days when she had a car to drive and life seemed just a little bit easier, but that car was now nothing more than a rusting hulk sitting in the backyard, a reminder of what she had lost. One day, Emily whispered to herself, her breath visible in the chilly air. One day, I'll get you fixed up, old girl. It was a promise she made every morning as she passed by the side street where her car used to take her to work. But for now, her feet were her only means of transportation, and the road ahead was long. As she walked, the sky began to lighten, revealing the town in its early morning stillness. She passed by familiar faces, early risers who, like her, were starting their day. Mr. Johnson, the elderly man who lived a few blocks away, was out in his garden, as he always was at this hour. "Morning, Emily," he called out, waving a gloved hand. Emily smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Morning, Mr. Johnson. You have a good one." Not all of her encounters were as friendly. As she walked through a more affluent part of town, she noticed curtains twitching, suspicious eyes peering out at her as she passed. One woman, dressed in expensive workout clothes, clutched her purse a little tighter as Emily walked by. But Emily kept her head held high, greeting her politely as she always did. "Good morning, ma'am." The woman huffed and hurried away, but Emily didn't let it bother her. She was used to it by now. The stares, the judgment. They didn't know her story, and frankly, she didn't care if they ever did. By the time the hospital came into view, the sun had risen, and the streets were bustling with traffic. Emily quickened her pace, not wanting to be late. Her legs ached, her feet screamed with every step, but she pushed through the pain. She couldn't afford to lose this job, not when her children were depending on her. As she approached the staff entrance, she caught a glimpse of herself in the glass doors, her hair slightly disheveled, dark circles under her eyes, her jacket worn and fraying at the edges. But she was still standing. That was what mattered. "Morning, Emily," called Sandra, a nurse just finishing the night shift. "How do you do it every day?" Emily smiled, her usual response ready. "One foot in front of the other, Sandra. That's all it takes." Inside, Emily changed into her uniform and gathered her cleaning supplies. As she started her rounds, the fatigue from her long walk melted away, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. She took pride in her work, knowing that her efforts contributed to the well-being of the patients and staff. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and it kept food on the table for her kids. During her lunch break, Emily sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, a simple sandwich in front of her. She pulled out her phone to check on Jake and Sophie. A text from Jake lit up her screen. "Hope you're having a good day, Mom. Love you." Emily's eyes misted over as she typed a reply, her heart swelling with love for her children. They never complained about their circumstances, never asked why they couldn't have new clothes or why she didn't drive them to school like the other kids. They just accepted it, their resilience only making her more determined to provide for them. As her shift ended, Emily steeled herself for the long walk home. The sun was setting as she left the hospital, and the streets were growing quiet again. But this time, something felt different. As she turned onto the road that would take her home, she noticed a police car parked on the side of the street. The officer inside seemed to be watching her. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Had something happened to her kids? Was there an emergency she didn't know about? But as she walked past, the officer, Officer Luke Carter, she realized, simply nodded at her. Emily returned the gesture with a polite smile, her pace quickening. She had seen him a few times recently, always watching her from a distance. It made her a little uneasy, but she brushed it off. She hadn't done anything wrong after all. The walk home was always harder than the walk to work. By the time Emily turned onto her street, her legs were trembling with exhaustion. But then, just as she neared her house, the front door flew open, and two small figures came racing out to greet her. "Mommy!" Sophie cried, flinging herself into Emily's arms. Jake followed close behind, a wide grin on his face. Emily hugged them tightly, her fatigue melting away in their embrace. This was what made it all worthwhile. Her children, their love, their trust in her. "Hey, my loves," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "I missed you so much." Later that night, as she tucked Sophie into bed, her daughter asked sleepily, "Mommy, why do you have to leave so early every day?" Emily smoothed her daughter's hair, choosing her words carefully. "Well, sweetie, sometimes we have to work extra hard to make our dreams come true. But don't you worry. Everything I do for you and Jake." Sophie smiled, her eyes closing as she drifted off to sleep. Emily watched her for a moment, then retreated to her own room. She sank onto her bed, her muscles screaming in protest, and let out a quiet sigh. Tomorrow would bring another 30-mile journey, another day of hardship and struggle. But as she set her alarm for the early morning, she felt a flicker of hope in her heart. One day things would be better. And until that day came, she would keep walking, one step at a time. The routine was the same each day. Waking before dawn, the long walk, and the slow, methodical cleaning shifts at the hospital. But for Emily, the days felt longer than ever. With every step, the weight of exhaustion pressed harder on her. She had always prided herself on her strength, but lately it was becoming harder to hold everything together. The 30 miles to St. Mark's Hospital were an unrelenting test of her willpower. Each morning her body protested, but her mind forced her forward. She told herself the same mantra every day. This is for Jake and Sophie. Every step is for them. Still, the miles felt longer, the road steeper, and the people along her route more distant. She smiled through it, pretending the blisters didn't sting, and her back wasn't aching. She refused to let her children see how much she struggled, but things were changing in ways she couldn't ignore. Jake had been having trouble in school. His teachers mentioned he seemed distracted, his grades slipping, and the science projects he once loved had taken a backseat to worry. Sophie's asthma had flared up recently, and the stress of keeping her healthy weighed on Emily's mind as much as the walking weighed on her feet. Despite her efforts, the cracks were beginning to show. One rainy morning, the walk felt especially unbearable. The rain soaked through Emily's thin jacket, drenching her clothes underneath. Each step sent water splashing from her shoes as she trudged along the empty road. The few cars that passed sprayed cold water onto her legs, but she ignored them. She had gotten used to being invisible. That was the morning officer Luke Carter decided to follow her. Luke had been curious about Emily since the day he first saw her walking. At first it seemed normal. Lots of people walked in town after all. But as the weeks went on, he noticed her more and more. She walked the same route every day, at the same time, in the same worn-out sneakers. Something about her persistence stuck with him. Luke Carter wasn't just any cop. He prided himself on knowing the community. He grew up in the same town and had been an officer here for over a decade. He knew most of the faces in town, but Emily was a mystery. She never looked for help, never even seemed to want it. She walked with determination, her eyes fixed forward, never stopping to chat with anyone. At first, Luke dismissed it. Maybe she just liked the exercise. But as he observed her more closely, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her clothes were always clean but worn, her shoes nearly falling apart. And there was that quiet exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped by the end of the day when he saw her walking home. He couldn't help but wonder why she was walking such long distances every day, in every type of weather. Surely she could afford a bus fare or a ride-sharing app. And why didn't she accept his offers for a ride when he'd pass by in the mornings? Curiosity gnawed at him, and that rainy morning, he decided to follow her all the way to her destination. Emily had barely noticed the police car trailing a distance behind her. She was too focused on reaching the hospital before her shift began. Her legs ached more than usual, the cold seeping into her bones as she pushed through the rain. By the time she reached the edge of town, the wet streets glistening under the faint streetlights, she was soaked to the skin. Luke kept his patrol car at a careful distance, watching as Emily's pace slowed, but never stopped. Her resolve was impressive, but as the rain fell harder, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He didn't understand why she was putting herself through this every day. He followed her for another half hour, watching her turn down the narrow roads leading to St. Mark's Hospital. Finally, as she entered the staff door, marked for employees only, he parked and sat in his car, thinking. A hospital employee. That explained the early hours and the late return. But why walk 30 miles when public transport could cut the journey in half? And why did she seem so worn down? Luke decided to ask her directly the next morning. As Emily began her walk again, this time under clear skies, Luke pulled up beside her in his patrol car, his window rolled down. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out. Emily startled slightly, turning to look at him with a polite but guarded smile. "Yes, officer." "I couldn't help but notice you walking this route every day," Luke said, trying to sound as casual as possible. "It's early and it looks like you've got quite a journey ahead of you. Would you like a ride somewhere?" Emily hesitated, her smile faltering for just a second. For a moment, Luke saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was pride. But whatever it was, it disappeared as quickly as it came. "That's very kind of you, officer, but I'm fine. I'm used to walking," she said, her voice steady but firm. Luke nodded, sensing that pushing her might do more harm than good. "I understand," he replied, forcing a smile. "Just wanted to make sure you're all right. You have a good day now." As he drove away, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Emily's story than she was letting on. Why would someone choose to walk 30 miles every day? And why did she seem so reluctant to accept help? Over the next few weeks, Luke found himself paying more attention to Emily's routine. He saw her walking early in the mornings, her pace quick and purposeful, and then again in the evenings, her steps slower and her shoulders slumped with fatigue. The more he watched, the more concerned he became. On one particularly rainy day, he decided to follow her again, but this time more closely. He watched as she walked through puddles, her thin jacket doing little to shield her from the elements. She didn't stop to rest, even when the rain became so heavy that he could barely see her ahead. Her shoes squelched with every step, but still, she kept going. By the time she reached the hospital, Luke was convinced that something had to be done. This wasn't just about pride, it was about survival. Emily was pushing herself beyond her limits, and Luke couldn't stand by and watch her collapse. That evening, Luke sat down with his wife, Sarah, over dinner. "I can't stop thinking about her," he admitted, pushing his food around his plate. "That woman I've been telling you about. She walks 30 miles to work every day. I followed her today, discreetly, of course, and she was walking in the pouring rain, soaked to the bone." Sarah, always the more empathetic one in their relationship, frowned. "That sounds awful. Why doesn't she just take a bus or something? There must be another option." Luke shook his head. "I don't know. I've offered her a ride a few times, but she always turns me down. It's like she doesn't want help, even though she clearly needs it." "Maybe she doesn't have a choice," Sarah suggested. "You said she works at the hospital, right? Maybe her shifts start too early for public transport, or maybe she can't afford a bus fare every day." Luke had considered that, but hearing Sarah say it out loud made it all the more real. "Maybe," he said, his mind already spinning with possibilities. "But whatever the reason, she can't keep doing this. It's going to break her eventually." The next morning, Luke decided to try again. He drove the same route, pulling up beside Emily just as she was starting her walk. "Good morning," he called out, rolling down his window. "I know we've had this conversation before, but I couldn't help noticing that you're limping a bit today. Are you sure you don't want to ride?" Emily paused, her polite smile wavering. For the first time, Luke saw the mask she wore start to slip. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged ever so slightly, and the exhaustion that seemed to cling to her like a second skin. "I'm fine, officer," she said, though her voice lacked the conviction it once had. "Just a little sore from all the walking. Nothing to worry about." Luke nodded, but he didn't let it go this time. "I get that," he said gently, "but 30 miles every day is a lot. If you're in any kind of trouble, or if there's anything I can do to help—" Emily's expression tightened, and she cut him off before he could finish. "I appreciate your concern, officer, but really I'm okay. This is just something I need to do." Before Luke could say another word, Emily picked up her pace and walked on, her limp barely noticeable now as she hurried down the street. Luke watched her go, frustration and admiration mixing in his chest. He didn't understand why she was so determined to walk 30 miles every day, but one thing was clear. Whatever her reasons, Emily Thompson wasn't going to stop. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, something deeper than just pride, and he was determined to find out what it was. Despite Officer Luke Carter's attempts to help, Emily continued her daily routine of walking 30 miles to and from work. The physical toll was growing more severe, but she refused to let anyone see her pain. She was good at hiding it. She had been doing that ever since her husband left. But no matter how strong she was, her body had its limits. One morning, Emily woke up with a cough. It was nothing serious, just a slight tickle in her throat. She brushed it off, as she did with most things. But as the days went on, the cough grew worse. By the end of her shift at the hospital, her chest ached, and she struggled to catch her breath. The cold weather and the long walks weren't helping, but she couldn't afford to take time off. Her children needed her to keep working, to keep pushing forward. Jake had noticed something was wrong with his mother, though he didn't say anything at first. He could see it in the way she moved slower in the evenings, when she returned from work. How she winced when she thought no one was looking. The 12-year-old had always been perceptive, and he adored his mother for all she did. But lately he had been worrying about her more than ever. One evening, as Emily was preparing a simple dinner of rice and vegetables, Jake finally spoke up. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed with concern. Emily forced a smile, though her body screamed in protest with every movement. "I'm fine, honey. Just a little tired." Jake wasn't convinced. He had seen how much harder it was for her to get up in the mornings, how her cough had worsened. "You don't seem fine. Maybe you should take a day off." Emily shook her head, her smile faltering. I can't, Jake. We need the money and I can't afford to miss a shift. Jake sighed, looking down at his plate. He hated that his mother had to work so hard, and he hated that he couldn't do anything to help. But you're always tired, and you've been coughing a lot lately. Emily reached across the table and took his hand. I know you're worried, sweetheart, but I'm okay. Really. But Jake wasn't the only one who was concerned. Sophie, always sensitive to the mood in the house, had been acting out more frequently at school. Emily received a call from Sophie's teacher, informing her that Sophie had been getting into arguments with her classmates and seemed more withdrawn than usual. It broke Emily's heart to think that her children were feeling the weight of their situation as much as she was, but there was little she could do. She had to keep moving forward, for their sake. As Emily's cough worsened, her exhaustion reached a tipping point. One day at work, while cleaning a hallway on the 4th floor of the hospital, she felt a sharp pain in her chest. Her vision blurred, and the world tilted on its axis. Emily tried to steady herself by gripping the wall, but her legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The next thing she knew, she was lying in a hospital bed, the harsh fluorescent lights above her making her head throb. She blinked slowly, trying to make sense of what had happened. Sandra, the nurse who always greeted her in the mornings, was standing beside the bed, her expression one of deep concern. Emily, you passed out, Sandra said softly. We had to admit you're exhausted, and you've got a nasty case of bronchitis. You should have been resting, not walking in this weather. Emily's first thought wasn't for herself, it was for her children. Jake, Sophie, are they okay? She asked, her voice hoarse and strained. They're fine. I called your neighbor, Mrs. Adams. She's with them now. Emily breathed a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. How was she going to get home? How was she going to keep working if she couldn't walk? The fear of losing her job, of not being able to provide for her children, gnawed at her. Sandra placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. You need to rest, Emily. You're pushing yourself too hard. Emily tried to sit up, but the pain in her chest made her lie back down. She hated feeling weak. She hated that she couldn't just get up and keep going. But her body had finally rebelled against her, and she knew deep down that she couldn't keep living like this. While Emily lay in the hospital, Luke Carter was in his patrol car, parked in his usual spot. He had seen the ambulance pull up to the hospital earlier that day, but he hadn't thought much of it until now. As he sat in the stillness of his car, something gnawed at him, an unease he couldn't shake. He hadn't seen Emily walk by that morning, and now it was evening. Normally, by this time, she would have already made her long trek home. Luke's fingers tapped on the steering wheel as he debated with himself. Should he check in on her? He didn't want to intrude, but something told him that Emily might need more help than she was letting on. With a sigh, he turned the key in the ignition and made his way to the hospital. Luke wasn't prepared for what he found. As he entered the hospital, he spotted Sandra, the nurse, in the hallway. Hey, Sandra, Luke called out, trying to keep his tone light. I'm looking for someone. Emily Thompson. I think she works here. Have you seen her? Sandra's face fell. Officer Carter, she's in one of the rooms. She collapsed earlier today. Exhaustion and bronchitis. Luke's heart sank. He had known something was wrong, but hearing it out loud made it all the more real. Can I see her? Sandra hesitated for a moment before nodding. She's in room 312. Just take it easy on her, okay? She's been through a lot. Luke nodded and made his way to the room. When he walked in, the sight of Emily lying in the hospital bed hit him harder than he expected. She looked so small, so fragile, her face pale against the white sheets. Her eyes fluttered open as he approached. Officer Carter? She croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. Luke gave her a soft smile, pulling a chair up to the side of her bed. Emily, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. I was worried about you. Emily's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to blink them away. I'm fine, she said, though the words sounded hollow. I just need to rest, and I'll be back at work in no time. Luke shook his head. Emily, this isn't fine. You collapsed. You can't keep doing this to yourself. I have to, Emily whispered, her voice breaking. I don't have a choice. If I don't work, we won't have anything. My kids, they need me. For the first time, Luke saw past the polite smiles and the stoic facade Emily had been holding on to. He saw a woman who was terrified of failing her children, who was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, with no one to help her bear the load. "I understand," Luke said softly, "but you're not alone in this, Emily. There are people who want to help you. You just have to let them." Emily turned her head away, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had always prided herself on being strong, on not needing anyone. But now, lying in that hospital bed, she felt anything but strong. She felt broken. After a few moments of silence, Emily finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to ask for help, Officer Carter. I've been doing this on my own for so long. I don't even know where to start." Luke reached out and gently took her hand. "You don't have to do it alone anymore, Emily. I'm going to help you, and I know others will too. But you have to let us." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and vulnerability. "Why? Why would you want to help me?" Luke's expression softened. "Because I've seen how hard you work, how much you sacrifice for your kids, and because no one should have to carry that kind of burden alone." Emily's tears flowed freely now, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't try to stop them. She had been carrying so much for so long, and the thought of someone else helping her, really helping her, was almost too much to bear. For the next few days, Emily remained in the hospital, recovering from her illness. During that time, Luke began to put a plan into motion. He reached out to people in the community, starting with Sandra and a few others at the hospital, quietly asking if they knew about Emily's situation. Word spread quickly, and soon a small but growing group of people wanted to help. Luke kept it discreet, not wanting to overwhelm Emily just yet, but he knew that something had to change. She couldn't keep walking 30 miles every day. She needed her car repaired, and she needed a support system. When Emily was finally discharged from the hospital, Luke was there to pick her up. He offered her a ride home, and this time Emily didn't refuse. As they drove, she stared out the window, her thoughts racing. She knew things had to change, but she didn't know how to let go of the pride that had kept her going for so long. Luke pulled up to her house and parked the car. Before Emily could get out, he turned to her. "Emily, I've been talking to some people. People who care about you, who want to help. Your kids, your job, your health. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Emily looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "I don't know how to let people in," she whispered. Luke smiled gently. "One step at a time, Emily. Just like your walks. One step at a time." Emily had never been one to rely on others. Ever since her husband left, she had taken pride in doing everything on her own, working, caring for her children, managing the household. But lying in a hospital bed and now back home in her small, run-down house, she realized she couldn't keep going this way. Her body had finally given out, and the emotional toll had been mounting for months. The fear of failure, the fear of letting her children down, was what had driven her. But now it was clear she couldn't continue this journey alone. After Luke Carter dropped Emily off at home, he had made her a promise. He told her he was going to help her, but she didn't yet understand the extent of what he meant. She had seen the concern in his eyes, and despite her reluctance, something inside her had shifted. It was time to accept help. The next morning, Emily woke up to the sounds of her children getting ready for school. Jake was quietly helping Sophie with her backpack, carefully zipping it up while Sophie talked about the art project she was going to show her teacher. Emily smiled faintly as she watched them from her bed, still too weak to get up and prepare breakfast. They were good kids, resilient, understanding beyond their years. But she knew they were starting to worry about her, and that weighed on her heart. Jake came into her room, a frown creasing his forehead. "Mom, are you feeling better today?" Emily reached out and squeezed his hand. "A little better, sweetheart. I'm just tired. But don't worry about me. You and Sophie need to get to school on time, okay?" Jake hesitated, biting his lip. "Mrs. Adams said she can give us a ride this morning, but I don't like leaving you here alone. What if you need something?" "I'll be fine," Emily assured him, though the truth was she wasn't sure how she was going to manage the day ahead. "Go to school, Jake. I'll be here when you get home." Once the kids had left, Emily felt the emptiness of the house settle around her. She closed her eyes and let out a long, shaky breath. She had always prided herself on being strong, but now the burden felt too heavy. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think about what it would mean to accept help. Real help. Later that afternoon, Emily was startled by a knock at the door. Slowly, she made her way to open it, her body still aching from the bronchitis that hadn't yet fully left her system. To her surprise, there was Luke standing on her porch. But he wasn't alone. Next to him stood Mike, the owner of the local garage, a gruff but kind man whom Emily had seen around town. She hadn't spoken to him much, but everyone knew Mike. He was the kind of guy who kept to himself but was always there when people needed something fixed. "Hey, Emily," Luke said with a gentle smile. "I know you weren't expecting us, but I have some good news." Emily frowned, confused. "What's going on?" Mike stepped forward, holding his hands out as if to explain. "Luke here told me about your car situation. I know it's been sitting in your backyard for months, not going anywhere. He asked if I'd take a look at it." Emily blinked, her mind racing. You looked at my car?" Mike nodded. "Yeah, it wasn't in great shape, but it's not beyond repair. I went ahead and brought it over to the shop. I've got a few parts on order, and once those come in, we'll have her up and running again." Emily's hand flew to her mouth. The idea of having her car fixed, of being able to drive again, was almost too much to take in. "But I don't have the money to pay for repairs right now," Luke interrupted her gently. "You don't need to worry about that. Mike and I talked to some people in town, and we've already got the parts covered. The labor's on Mike. All you need to do is rest and let us take care of this." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. For months she had been walking 30 miles every day, believing she had no other choice. And now people she barely knew were stepping up to help her, asking for nothing in return. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, wiping at her eyes. "I don't deserve this." Luke shook his head. "You've been carrying so much on your own, Emily. It's time to let others help you. You're not in this alone anymore." Over the next few days, as Emily rested and tried to recover, more and more people in the community reached out to help. It started small. Her neighbor, Mrs. Adams, continued giving Jake and Sophie rides to school, offering to watch them in the afternoons until Emily felt well enough to manage on her own. Then the hospital staff pitched in, organizing a small fundraiser among themselves to help cover some of Emily's expenses. They had all seen how hard she worked, always with a quiet smile, and they wanted to do something to ease her burden. One morning, Emily received a visit from Sandra, the nurse who had been there the day she collapsed. Sandra brought with her a few bags of groceries, filled with fresh fruits, vegetables, and some of the foods Sophie needed for her asthma-friendly diet. "I know you're not feeling up to going out much yet," Sandra said as she set the groceries on the kitchen counter, "so we thought we'd take care of this for a while." Emily couldn't stop the tears from falling this time. She had spent so long hiding her struggles, pretending she didn't need anything from anyone. But now, as she watched these people, her neighbors, her colleagues, step in to help, she realized how wrong she had been to push them away. One evening, as Emily sat on the porch watching the sunset, she heard a familiar sound. The rumble of a car engine pulling into her driveway. She looked up, and there it was, her old car, now gleaming and running as smoothly as the day she bought it. Luke stepped out of the driver's seat, grinning. "Well, what do you think?" Emily couldn't believe her eyes. It's fixed?" Mike, who had followed in his own truck, gave her a nod. "Good as new. Took a bit of work, but she'll get you where you need to go." Emily stood, her legs trembling as she walked toward the car. She ran her hand along the hood, her breath catching in her throat. I don't know how to thank you." Luke smiled, his voice soft. "You don't need to thank us, Emily. We're just glad we could help." Emily turned to Mike, her voice breaking. This means so much to me. You have no idea how much this changes everything." Mike gave her a small smile. "Just promise me you'll take it easy, okay? Don't push yourself too hard." Emily nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I will. I promise." The car wasn't the only change in Emily's life. With her vehicle repaired, she no longer had to walk 30 miles to work, and the time and energy she gained allowed her to focus more on her children and her own health. Jake's grades began to improve, and Sophie's mood lifted now that their mother wasn't so worn down all the time. But perhaps the most important change was within Emily herself. She had spent years believing that accepting help was a sign of weakness, but now she saw it differently. Accepting help didn't make her weak, it made her human, and it didn't take away from the love and dedication she had for her children. If anything, it allowed her to be a better mother. Emily also began to think about how she could pay the kindness forward. Inspired by the outpouring of support she had received, she started visiting the community center on her days off. There, she met with other single parents who were struggling to make ends meet, offering them advice and encouragement. It wasn't much, but she knew how powerful it could be to simply listen, to let others know they weren't alone in their struggles. The more time Emily spent at the community center, the more she realized how many people in her town were quietly fighting their own battles. And just like her, they often felt like they had to do it all on their own. But things were starting to change. Slowly but surely, a sense of community was growing, and Emily was determined to be a part of it. One Saturday afternoon, Emily was sitting at the community center, chatting with a few other mothers who had come in for a support group. They were sharing stories, talking about the challenges of balancing work and parenting, when Luke walked in, a warm smile on his face. "Hey, Emily," he called out as he approached the table. "Mind if I sit down?" Emily smiled, gesturing to the empty chair. "Of course, Officer Carter." Luke sat down, glancing around the room. "I've been thinking, you've done a lot here, getting people to open up, helping other parents. But maybe we could do something bigger, something that brings the whole community together." Emily raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" Luke leaned forward, his voice filled with excitement. "I've been talking to some folks at the police department and the local businesses. What if we organized a community-wide event? Something like a Neighbors Helping Neighbors Day, where everyone can come together, share resources, and offer support to those who need it." Emily's eyes lit up at the idea. "That sounds incredible. Do you really think people would be interested?" Luke nodded. "I know they would. People just need a little push sometimes. And I think you're the perfect person to help get this started." Emily smiled, feeling a spark of hope ignite in her chest. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. And now she had the chance to give back, to help others find the same sense of hope and support that had lifted her up when she needed it most. In the weeks that followed, Emily and Luke worked tirelessly to organize the community event. They reached out to local businesses, schools, and churches, spreading the word and gathering volunteers. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life came forward, eager to help. They donated clothes, food, and even offered services like free childcare and job training. On the day of the event, the community center was buzzing with activity. Families mingled, children played, and volunteers worked together to ensure that everyone who came left with something, whether it was physical help or just a sense of belonging. Emily stood in the middle of it all, watching the scene with tears in her eyes. She had come so far from the woman who had once walked 30 miles a day, believing she had to carry the weight of the world alone. Now she was part of something bigger, something that reminded her every day that she wasn't alone, and neither was anyone else in this town. As the sun began to set, Luke walked up beside her, his arms crossed as he surveyed the bustling scene. "You did good, Emily," he said softly. Emily smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her. "No, Luke, we did good." And for the first time in a long time, Emily truly believed that things were going to be okay. Emily stood in front of the crowd gathered at the community center, the warm light of the setting sun casting a golden glow over everyone. It had been months since the darkest days of her life, and she hardly recognized herself from those times. She was no longer the woman walking 30 miles a day, burdened with the weight of the world on her shoulders. Today, she was a woman standing in front of her town, filled with hope and surrounded by a community that had not only supported her, but also inspired her to do the same for others. The Neighbors Helping Neighbors event had become a huge success. People from every corner of town had come to lend a hand. Business owners offering services for free, families donating clothes and toys, volunteers organizing activities for children while parents received much-needed assistance. It wasn't just an event, it was a movement, a symbol of what their town could be when people came together. Luke Carter stood by her side, his arms crossed and a proud smile on his face as he watched the community bustling around them. He had been the catalyst for this change, helping Emily realize that accepting help didn't mean weakness. It meant strength in numbers. And now Emily was ready to give back in ways she had never imagined. As Emily looked around at the people who had gathered, her heart swelled with emotion. Jake and Sophie ran around with other children, their laughter filling the air, a sound that had once been rare in their small home. Her children were thriving. Jake had improved his grades in school, no longer distracted by worry for his mother. He had even started working on a new science project, his love for learning rekindled. Sophie had been happier too, her asthma under control, and her artistic talents growing with every day that passed. Emily felt a lump form in her throat as she thought about how far they had come. It wasn't just the physical help, the repaired car, the groceries, the support from her neighbors. It was the emotional weight that had been lifted. She had learned that she didn't have to carry the burden alone. After the event, Luke approached her, his smile soft. "You did it, Emily. Look at all of this," he said, gesturing to the crowd still mingling around the center. "This is what happens when people come together." Emily smiled, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you, Luke. Without everyone who stepped in when I needed them most." Luke chuckled. "You had it in you all along. Sometimes it just takes a little push to see it." Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd. It was true. She had always believed that strength meant doing everything on her own. But now she understood that true strength came from knowing when to lean on others. As the sun began to set, the crowd started to disperse, families gathering their belongings and saying their goodbyes. But Emily wasn't ready to leave just yet. She had one more thing to do. Emily stepped up to the small stage they had set up for the event. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest as she raised her hand to get everyone's attention. "Excuse me, everyone," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The crowd quieted, turning their attention to her. "I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for everything you've done, not just for me, but for each other. This event, this community, it's something special. I used to think that asking for help meant I was weak, that I had to do everything on my own. But I was wrong. You all showed me that true strength comes from letting others in, from being part of something bigger than yourself." She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. "When I was walking 30 miles a day, I thought I had no other choice. I thought that was just the way things had to be. But you all stepped in and showed me that I didn't have to do it alone. And now, I want to pay that forward. I want to keep helping others the way you all helped me." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, and Emily felt tears prick her eyes. "We've started something amazing here, and I know we can keep it going. Together, we can build a community where no one has to struggle in silence, where everyone knows they have people who care about them. I'm so grateful to be a part of that." As she finished speaking, the crowd erupted into applause. Emily smiled through her tears, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment and joy. She had come a long way from the woman who had once walked in the darkness, feeling invisible and alone. Now she was part of a community that lifted each other up and thrived together. The weeks following the event were some of the most fulfilling of Emily's life. The Neighbors Helping Neighbors initiative grew larger than anyone had expected. Word spread beyond their small town, and soon neighboring towns were reaching out, asking how they could start similar programs. Emily found herself busier than ever, not just at work but also in her newfound role as a community leader. She was helping to organize food drives, clothing donations, and even job training programs for single parents like herself. The local businesses that had pitched in to help her continued to support the cause, offering services to those in need. Emily's role at the hospital expanded too. After everything she had been through, the hospital administration recognized her leadership qualities and offered her a position overseeing the hospital's outreach programs, a job that not only paid better, but also allowed her to continue helping people. Her children too had blossomed. Jake had just entered a science fair, and his project, a homemade solar panel, had garnered the attention of his teachers and fellow students. Sophie had begun taking art classes at the community center, her talent growing by the day. The children knew things had changed for the better, and they were proud of their mother for everything she had done, not just for them, but for the entire community. One day, Emily received a call from Luke, his voice brimming with excitement. "Emily, I've got something to show you. Can you meet me at the community center?" Curious, Emily agreed and headed over to the center after picking up Sophie from school. When she arrived, she saw Luke standing outside with a group of people, many of whom she recognized from the event weeks earlier. "What's going on?" Emily asked, smiling as she approached. Luke grinned, stepping aside to reveal a large banner hanging over the entrance of the community center. It read, "Emily Thompson Community Outreach Program." Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is this?" Luke laughed. "It's for you. The hospital wanted to do something to recognize everything you've done for the community. They're officially naming their outreach program after you. You've become a symbol of hope around here, Emily." Emily's eyes filled with tears. She couldn't believe it. Her name, her journey, was now a part of something that would continue to help others for years to come. "I don't know what to say," Emily whispered, overwhelmed by the gesture. "You've earned this," Luke said, his voice soft. "You've changed this community, Emily. You've inspired people to step up and make a difference. This is just the beginning." As the outreach program grew, so did Emily's sense of purpose. She found herself connecting with people she never would have met before, learning their stories and helping them find the support they needed. Every day was a reminder of how much a simple act of kindness could ripple out and change lives. But despite everything she had accomplished, Emily never forgot where she had come from. She never forgot the days when she had felt alone, walking 30 miles every day, believing that she had to carry the burden by herself. And she never forgot the people who had stepped in when she needed it most, the people who had shown her that she didn't have to walk alone. One evening, as Emily drove home after a long day at the hospital, she took a detour down the road she had once walked every morning and evening. It was strange seeing it from behind the wheel of her car, knowing how far she had come since those days. The road was the same, but everything else had changed. As she drove, memories of her past self flooded her mind. The exhaustion, the fear, the relentless drive to keep going, even when her body wanted to give out. But those memories were no longer painful. They were a testament to how far she had come, how much she had grown. Emily parked her car at the side of the road and stepped out, breathing in the cool evening air. She stood there for a moment, looking down the long stretch of road that had once felt like an endless burden. But now, standing here, she realized that every step she had taken on that road had led her to where she was today. The sound of an approaching car pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Luke driving up, his patrol car slowing to a stop beside her. "Thought I might find you here," he said, stepping out of the car. Emily smiled, nodding toward the road. "I just wanted to see it again. It feels different now." Luke looked down the road with her, his expression thoughtful. "It's funny how things change, isn't it? That road used to be something you had to endure. Now it's just part of the journey." Emily nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over her. "Yeah, it's just part of the journey." The town had changed too. The Neighbors Helping Neighbors program continued to flourish, with new initiatives popping up all the time. The local school had started a mentorship program for at-risk youth, pairing them with community leaders who could guide them toward brighter futures. The hospital's outreach program, now named after Emily, expanded to include free medical services for low-income families. The community center became a hub of activity, a place where people knew they could go for help, no matter their circumstances. A year after the first Neighbors Helping Neighbors event, the town held a celebration in Emily's honor. It was a day filled with music, food, and laughter, a day where the community came together once again to celebrate how far they had come. As Emily stood on stage looking out at the crowd, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for everything that had brought her here. She knew there would always be challenges ahead, but now she had something she hadn't had before: a community, a sense of belonging, and the knowledge that she never had to walk alone again. And that, she realized, was the greatest gift of all. The day of the celebration was perfect. The sky was clear, the air warm with a gentle breeze that carried the sounds of laughter and music through the park. Families, friends, and neighbors had gathered from across town, setting up picnic blankets, folding chairs, and tables filled with food. The Neighbors Helping Neighbors program had become a staple of the community, a symbol of hope and support, and today they were celebrating 1 year of its success. Emily stood on the stage, looking out at the crowd with a deep sense of pride. The journey she had been on felt surreal now, as if the woman who had once walked 30 miles a day under the weight of exhaustion was someone else entirely. In truth, she was still that woman, but now she was so much more. The struggles that had once defined her were now the foundation of her strength, and that strength had been magnified by the people standing before her. As she took a deep breath, preparing to speak, she spotted Jake and Sophie sitting in the front row, their smiles wide as they waved up at her. They had changed so much over the past year, thriving in ways she had only dreamed of when things were at their worst. Jake's science project had taken him to the state science fair, where he had won second place. He was already talking about becoming an engineer one day. Sophie, her artistic spirit shining more brightly than ever, had her paintings displayed at the community center. Emily couldn't be prouder of the people they were becoming, and she knew that none of it would have been possible without the help they'd received. She looked over at Luke, who stood beside the stage, arms crossed and a proud smile on his face. He gave her an encouraging nod, and she felt a surge of gratitude for everything he had done. Luke had been the first to notice, the first to reach out, and the one who had stayed by her side every step of the way. She owed him more than she could ever express, and she knew that their bond would last a lifetime. "Good afternoon, everyone," Emily began, her voice carrying through the speakers. The crowd quieted, turning their attention to her. "I want to start by thanking you all for being here today. This celebration isn't just about me or about the program, it's about all of you, about what we've built together over the past year. When I think back to where I was a year ago, walking 30 miles a day just to get by, I never could have imagined this. I never could have imagined standing here, surrounded by a community that has shown me more love and support than I ever thought possible." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "This past year has taught me that no one has to walk alone. We all have our struggles, our hardships, but when we come together, we can lift each other up. We can be stronger together than we ever could be on our own. That's what Neighbors Helping Neighbors is all about. It's about being there for one another, even when times are tough." The crowd erupted into applause, and Emily smiled through her tears. She glanced down at Jake and Sophie, who were beaming up at her with pride. For them, she had walked through the darkness, and now she stood in the light, ready to continue leading by example. As the celebration went on, Emily mingled with the crowd, chatting with families and volunteers, listening to their stories of how the program had impacted their lives. Some told her how they had been able to find jobs through the job training programs, while others shared how the food drives and childcare services had taken a burden off their shoulders. Everywhere she turned, there were smiles and laughter, and it filled her with a sense of accomplishment, unlike anything she had ever felt. She caught up with Sarah and Mike, the couple she had helped months ago when their son had been struggling with his autism diagnosis. They had become close friends, and their gratitude for the support they'd received was palpable. "Emily," Sarah said, pulling her into a hug, "I don't know where we'd be without you in the program. Tommy's doing so much better now, and we've been able to find a great therapist for him thanks to the connections you made for us." Emily smiled, her heart full. "I'm just glad we could help. You and Mike are doing an amazing job with him." Mike nodded, his eyes filled with appreciation. "You've changed a lot of lives, Emily. Don't forget that." Later in the evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the park, Emily found a quiet moment to reflect. She stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as families packed up their picnic baskets and children ran through the grass, their laughter echoing in the air. The peace she felt in that moment was something she had never imagined she could find. Luke approached, standing beside her in silence for a few moments before speaking. "You did good, Emily," he said softly. "This whole town is better because of you." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you, Luke. You were the one who started all of this. You were the first person to see me when I was invisible." Luke chuckled, shaking his head. "You were never invisible, Emily. You just needed someone to remind you of how strong you are." They stood there for a while, watching the town they had both worked so hard to help. It was a town transformed, not just by one person's actions, but by the collective power of a community that had come together in a time of need. The journey that had started with 30 miles of isolation and struggle had led to a future filled with connection, compassion, and hope. A few weeks later, Emily sat at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee in her hand, as she watched Jake and Sophie finish their homework. Life had settled into a peaceful rhythm, and every day she woke up feeling grateful for the second chance she had been given. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a text from Luke. "Hey, I've got something to show you. Meet me at the community center?" Curious, Emily grabbed her keys and headed out the door. When she arrived at the community center, Luke was waiting for her outside, a familiar grin on his face. "What's going on?" Emily asked as she approached. Luke led her inside where a small group of people were gathered around a table. In the center of the table was a large stack of envelopes. "These are letters," Luke explained, "from people all over the state. They heard about the program, and they want to start similar initiatives in their own towns." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. "All of these people, they want to start their own Neighbors Helping Neighbors?" Luke nodded. "You've inspired people, Emily. What we started here is spreading, and people want to know how they can make it happen in their own communities. They're asking for your help." Emily felt a lump form in her throat as she picked up one of the envelopes, reading the heartfelt words of someone from a small town 3 hours away. They wanted advice and resources, anything that could help them create the same kind of support system Emily had built. "This is incredible," Emily whispered. I never thought it would grow like this." Luke smiled, his voice soft. "You've changed lives, Emily, and now you're going to change even more." In the months that followed, Emily worked tirelessly to answer every letter, sending out materials, organizing meetings, and helping towns across the state set up their own versions of Neighbors Helping Neighbors. The ripple effect of her journey had expanded far beyond what she had ever imagined, touching lives she would never even meet. But no matter how far the program spread, Emily always remembered where it started, on that lonely road she used to walk every day, believing she had to carry her burdens alone. Now she knew better. Now she knew that community was the greatest strength of all. And as she continued her work, she carried with her the lessons she had learned along the way. That asking for help didn't make her weak, that true strength came from lifting others up, and that, no matter how long the road, no one had to walk it alone. As Emily's story shows, we all have the power to make a difference, no matter how small our actions may seem. The journey may be long, but with support and community, no one has to walk it alone. If this story of hope and resilience inspired you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for more uplifting stories like this one. Let us know in the comments how you would support your community, and don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Together, we can create a world where no one is left behind.